Have you ever noticed that your deepest growth happened not in company, but in silence? That the periods you most wanted to escape yourself, the ones where the walls felt closer each morning, and the ordinary noise of other people seemed to come from somewhere very far away, were precisely the ones that changed you most? And what if the solitude that still follows you like a shadow, the kind you have never quite been able to explain to anyone who has not felt it, were not a wound to be healed, not a symptom of something broken inside you, but the very forge that made you who you are? Perhaps that question landed somewhere you were not expecting. Friedrich Nietzsche understood something about solitude that most of us spend years resisting. Not the romantic kind, not the solitude of long walks at dusk or the pleasant quiet of a Sunday morning, but the heavier kind, the solitude that arrives uninvited, that outlasts your patience for it, that teaches you things about yourself you would have preferred not to know. Nietzsche called it the condition of becoming. He believed, and wrote with a force that still unsettles people a century and a half later, that strength is not something you are given. It is something that is carved out of you, often without your consent, often in the absence of anyone who might witness the carving. His idea of the will to power is frequently misread as a hunger for dominance over others. But what Nietzsche meant was something quieter and far more demanding than that. He meant the drive to overcome yourself, not the version of you that others are comfortable with, but the version you have been settling for because it was easier to maintain. The will to power, in its truest sense, is the refusal to become a fixed thing. It is the insistence on continuing to grow, even when growth requires you to shed what no longer fits, even when what no longer fits includes relationships, certainties, and versions of yourself that once felt essential. And here is where solitude enters, not as a backdrop to this process, but as its very medium. In company, the self performs. This is not dishonesty. It is simply how human beings survive together, adjusting, softening, finding the register that keeps the room intact. You have done it. Everyone has, and there is no shame in it. But Nietzsche noticed something. The performing self and the becoming self cannot easily occupy the same moment. When you are managing how you are received, you are not free to discover what you actually are. The audience, even a kind audience, even a loving one, exerts a kind of gravity that pulls the self back toward the familiar, back toward the shape that already has a name in someone else's mind. Solitude removes that gravity. In the emptiness it leaves behind, and yes, it is an emptiness. Nietzsche was never sentimental enough to pretend otherwise. Something begins that cannot begin any other way. The self stops auditioning. It stops translating itself into terms that will be understood and accepted. And in that silence, slowly, what was always underneath the performance begins to surface. This is not a comfortable process. Nietzsche knew this, and he did not soften it. He wrote in the voice of a man who had walked this road and found it beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Because to grow this way, in silence, through difficulty, by meeting yourself without the mercy of distraction, is to outgrow the rooms you once fit inside. It is to return to conversations that used to feel like home and find that something has shifted, that the words land differently now, that you are somehow both present and a little further away than you were before. That is not a social failure. It is the price of a particular kind of formation, and it is a price Nietzsche believed was worth paying, though he was honest enough to admit that not everyone who pays it emerges unchanged in the ways they hoped. Maybe you have already paid some of it. Maybe you are in the middle of paying it right now, without a name for what is happening, wondering whether the distance you feel from certain people, certain places, even certain earlier versions of yourself, is loss or simply change seen too closely to be understood yet. Imagine a small forge at the edge of a village, not the kind that works through summer when the air is warm and the bellows easy, but the kind that only opens in winter, The blacksmith there understood something the others found strange. That metal, worked in cold, becomes different metal. The shock of the temperature, the resistance of the material, the way it holds heat longer, precisely because it has to fight to receive it. These are not obstacles to the work. They are the work. A blade hammered in warmth may look the same, but press your thumb along its edge, and you will feel the difference. The forge at the edge of the village sat empty through the easy months. It was only when the cold made the work hard that the work became worth doing. Perhaps the coldest seasons of your life were not interruptions to your formation. Perhaps they were the forge itself. The winter when the relationship ended and the apartment felt like a word you had forgotten the meaning of. The months when the phone stopped offering the relief it once did, when even noise became a kind of loneliness because it was never quite the right noise. The long stretches where you tried to explain something important to someone who listened carefully and still did not quite reach it, not out of cruelty, but out of distance, the kind that no amount of goodwill can fully close. Those seasons felt like suspension, like waiting for the real life to resume. But metal does not experience the hammer as education. It simply endures, and then it becomes something it could not have been before. There is a mechanism behind this, a specific difference between the solitude that tempers and the solitude that merely wounds, and it is not, as people tend to assume, a matter of willpower or of being the kind of person who handles aloneness well. The distinction is quieter than that, and more precise, and it matters enough that it deserves its own space. It will come, but not yet. For now, hold the question, why does the same silence break one person and build another? Because the answer, when it arrives, will ask something of you that simple encouragement never does. What you may have read during those winters as the failure to belong, the gathering you left early because the conversation kept sliding off something you could not name, the friendships that asked you to be slightly less than you were, the relationships that felt like translation work, always rendering yourself into a language the other person could receive. None of that was evidence of a flaw in your design. It was evidence of a particular kind of interior life that has moved, often without choosing to, beyond certain inherited agreements about what matters, what is worth saying, what constitutes an evening well spent. The ache you carry in those moments is real. Do not let anyone, including this voice, make it smaller than it is. But it may be that the ache is not the wound. It may be the signature, the specific pain of a psyche that has outpaced the maps it was handed and has not yet drawn new ones to match where it actually is. How many times did you soften your real opinion to keep the room comfortable? How many times did you say you were fine because the truth was too large and too shapeless to offer someone who had not asked for something that heavy? How many times did you come home from an evening with people who were kind, people who meant well, and feel somehow more alone than you had felt in the hours before you went? That particular loneliness, the loneliness that lives inside company rather than outside it, is among the most disorienting things a person can carry, because it offers no clean diagnosis. You cannot say you were abandoned, you were there, everyone was there, and yet, that loneliness is not a social verdict. It is a depth gauge. Jung would name what happens in those moments with some precision: the self you bring into a room, the version that knows which edges to smooth, which silences to fill, which parts of yourself to leave in the coat at the door. He called that the persona. Not a lie, exactly. A necessary translation. We all wear one. The question is whether we can take it off. And the only place most people can genuinely set the persona down, without audience, without the invisible pressure of being witnessed and assessed, is in solitude. Not performed solitude, not solitude as aesthetic, but the real thing, the kind that has no agenda and no end time, and sometimes arrives without being invited. in the form of a winter you did not choose. And when solitude arrives that way, uninvited, without a scheduled end, something else stirs beneath the persona. Jung called it the shadow, not the villain of the self, not the worst of you, but the accumulated weight of everything you decided was too much to show. The grief you processed faster than you actually felt it. The ambition you called arrogance before anyone else could. The need for something deeper than surface conversation that you learned to mask as contentment. These things do not disappear because you refuse to introduce them. They move into the interior and wait, and solitude is when they finally find the corridor unlocked. To meet your shadow is not comfortable. It rarely feels like insight at first. It feels, more often, like a reckoning, like being confronted with the gap between the person you perform and the person you are, when the performance is no longer sustainable. But here is what Jung understood that most popular self-improvement does not. The goal is not to defeat the shadow, to correct it, to replace it with something more acceptable. The goal is integration. To look at the unacknowledged parts and say, "These also belong to me." That act of recognition, quiet, private, done alone, is perhaps the most significant work a human being can do, and it cannot be done in a crowded room. This is where Nietzsche enters the picture, not as a provocateur, but as a diagnostician. He understood something about the structure of human becoming that is often buried under the more theatrical readings of his work. The concept that matters here, the one that is most misread, is what he called the Übermensch, a word that has been draped in misappropriations for over a century. Strip those away, and what remains is a psychological idea, not a moral hierarchy. The Übermensch is not the strongest person in the room. It is not the loudest or the most ruthless. It is, more precisely, the self that has stopped outsourcing its values. The self that has examined what it was handed at birth, the approval structures, the inherited definitions of success, the particular flavor of self-worth your specific family and culture agreed to recognize, and has asked, with genuine honesty, "Do I actually believe this, or did I simply absorb it before I had the vocabulary to question it?" That question is easy to write. It is nearly impossible to answer in company, because the pressure of collective approval does not announce itself. It does not arrive as a demand. It arrives as atmosphere, the almost imperceptible shift in a room when you say something that does not confirm what the room already believes, the slight contraction you feel before you speak, the way you learn, over time, to time your opinions to the temperature of the people around you. You do not notice yourself performing. You only notice, afterward, the faint exhaustion. Nietzsche saw this clearly. He wrote that the individual who begins to create their own values must first survive a profound loneliness, not as a punishment, but as the necessary condition for hearing themselves clearly. The noise of collective expectation is not loud enough to identify. It is ambient. And the only way to turn it down is to remove yourself for long enough from the room where it plays. Imagine a musician who has spent years playing in an ensemble, reading the conductor, adjusting their tempo to what the group needs. One day, they are left alone in a practice room with no sheet music and no audience. The first thing they notice is not freedom, it is disorientation. Their hands hover over the instrument, and they realize they do not know, with certainty, what they would choose to play if no one were listening, if no one were going to assess it, if there were no correct answer waiting to be confirmed. That silence before the first note, that is the silence of beginning to know yourself, and it is uncomfortable in proportion to how long you have been playing for others. The loneliness that follows people who think differently is made of exactly this. It is not social failure. It is the signature of a psyche that has, slowly and often painfully, moved beyond certain inherited agreements. Agreements about what to want, what to value, what constitutes a life worth living, and finds that the rooms built around those agreements no longer quite fit. The ache is real. Do not let anyone tell you it is not. But perhaps it is the ache of a frame being outgrown, rather than the ache of something broken. The self you were always meant to become could not have been built in the presence of applause. And the people who left during that process, who grew, uncomfortable in your silence, who needed you to stay smaller so they could stay certain, they were not villains. That framing would be too easy and too dishonest. They were people running their own invisible wars, carrying their own unexamined fears, built for a different kind of pressure than the one your life was asking you to bear. Their leaving was not a verdict on your worth. It was simply two different trajectories becoming visible at once. Perhaps every departure that felt like rejection was, in another light, the space clearing itself. Not cruelly, not as punishment, but the way a room empties before new furniture arrives. Not because the room was wrong, but because what is coming requires more space than what was already there. How many times did you soften your real opinion to keep the room comfortable? How many times did you watch an idea you actually believed in dissolve on your tongue before it reached the air, because you already knew the reception it would get? How many times did you say, "I'm fine," not as a lie exactly, but as a mercy, because the truth of what you were carrying was too dense for the conversation that was on offer? And how many times did you return home from a gathering, from a dinner, from an evening, surrounded by people who meant you no harm, and feel more profoundly alone than you had felt in days of actual solitude? That last sensation is worth sitting with, because it tells you something important. Solitude and loneliness are not the same country. They share a border, but the interior is completely different. Loneliness is the pain of disconnection from others. But what you feel when you come home from that dinner is something older and quieter. It is the pain of disconnection from yourself, from the version of you that was waiting patiently at home while you performed a version that could fit through the door of that particular evening. The exhaustion you feel is not social. It is the exhaustion of costume. Imagine an animal adapted to crushing pressure and absolute darkness at the bottom of the ocean. A creature built for depths where light has never reached, where the weight of the water above would be lethal to anything that had not evolved precisely for it. Bring that creature to the surface, into warmth, into light, into the shallows where most living things move and feed and belong, and it will not thrive. Not because it is damaged, not because it failed to adapt, but because it was built for a different depth entirely, and the surface, however bright, is simply not its element. The shallows are not wrong. The creature is not wrong. They are answers to different questions. What you sometimes read as your inability to belong, the fatigue after small talk, the faint grief of leaving places that others seem to leave easily, the sense of watching social life from a slight but permanent distance, may not be evidence of something missing in you. It may be evidence of the depth you were built to carry, the pressure you have survived, the darkness you have sat inside long enough to stop being afraid of it, the weight of questions that most people sensibly set down. These are not deficits. They are adaptations. You became what the conditions required, and something in you that is very quiet already knows this, even when the louder parts insist on calling it failure. This is where Jung becomes quietly necessary. The self you show in company, warm, capable, appropriate, agreeable in the right proportions. Jung called the persona, the face we construct for the social world, neither false nor fully true, a working agreement between the interior self and what the exterior world can receive. There is nothing wrong with the persona. We all need one. But solitude is the only place where it can be set down without consequence, where the face worn for others can rest on the table for a moment, and what lies beneath, what Jung called the shadow, the unacknowledged interior, the parts of you that never made it into the performance, can surface and be met without an audience. And that meeting is not comfortable. The shadow carries what you refused, what you were told to hide, what you learned early was not welcome. Meeting it requires exactly the kind of silence you may have spent years trying to fill. There is a face passing through your mind right now, isn't there? Someone who seemed to trigger something in you, disproportionate to what they actually did. That disproportion is almost always the shadow speaking. The pattern will not stop with that face. It will arrive again, wearing a different name. There is a separate video that maps this mechanism precisely. You will find it in the pinned first comment, or on the screen beside this one. And yet, understanding the shadow is only half the reckoning, because the shadow does not form in isolation, it forms in relation. It forms in the specific rooms where you learned which parts of yourself were welcome and which parts had to wait outside. Which means that the people who shaped your solitude are not incidental to this story. They are, perhaps, the very architects of the depth you now carry. Consider the ones who left, the friends who slowly faded, the relationships that ended not in argument but in distance, the people who grew visibly uncomfortable as you changed, not because you became worse, but because you became more precisely yourself. There is a particular grief in that kind of departure. It does not announce itself. It arrives gradually, like a tide withdrawing, and one day you notice the shore is empty, and you are not entirely sure when the water left. It is tempting, and perhaps honest, to feel the sting of that as rejection, to search your own behavior for the fault, to wonder what you said, what you failed to say, what version of yourself you might have performed more convincingly. But perhaps there is another way to hold that absence. Jung understood that the persona, the face we wear in company, is not a deception so much as a negotiation, an ongoing, largely unconscious agreement between what we truly are and what the social world can receive. And when a person begins to individuate, to move toward a more genuine interior life, that negotiation changes. The terms shift, and some people, those who were only ever in relationship with the persona, find themselves suddenly standing across from someone they no longer recognize. Not because you disappeared, but because you arrived. Imagine a lantern that has been covered for years with colored glass, carefully chosen to cast light in the precise hue that made the room most comfortable for everyone else. And then, slowly, the colored glass begins to fall away, not deliberately, not aggressively, but simply because the heat of genuine becoming makes it impossible to hold in place. The light that emerges is brighter, cleaner, more completely itself, but it is not the light the room was arranged to receive. And some of the furniture, placed to flatter the old color, looks different now. Some of it no longer fits. Some people, too, were arranged around your covered light, and when the glass fell, they moved on, not out of malice, but out of incompatibility. They were not villains. This matters, and it deserves to be said slowly. The people who could not stay were running their own invisible wars, carrying their own shadows, honoring their own unspoken agreements, living inside the logic of their own formation. Their leaving was not a verdict on your worth. It was, at most, a statement about distance, the distance between where they were and where you were going. Condemnation is the easy response, and it costs you something, because the moment you make them the reason for your pain, you hand them the authorship of your story, and that story belongs to you. There is a name in Nietzsche's thinking for the moment a person stops borrowing the values of the herd and begins to forge their own. He called it the revaluation of values. Not a rebellion, not a performance of independence, but a quiet and devastating recognition that the framework you inherited was built for someone else's life. And that recognition, almost without exception, is lonely. Not because the person has become cold or unreachable, but because the maps everyone else is using no longer describe the territory they are standing in. The self you were always meant to become could not have been built in the presence of applause. That silence, that specific ache of not being fully met, of speaking and feeling the words land somewhere short of understanding, may be the very condition under which something irreplaceable is being made. Not in spite of the loneliness. Because of it, the departures cleared the room. The quiet filled the space. And in that space, without the constant pressure of performance, without the need to negotiate your light into a color the room could accept, something in you had the chance, at last, to stand fully upright. Not every absence is a loss. Sometimes it is the only way back to the parts of yourself you abandoned. And there is a face passing through your mind right now, isn't there? Not an abstract person, a specific one, someone who left, or someone who stayed but never quite arrived, or someone whose absence you still turn over, in quiet moments like a stone, you keep expecting to find something written underneath. You know the feeling I mean, the particular weight of that unfinished thing. Here is what may be worth sitting with. The pattern behind that face will not end with that face. A different person will carry the same shape into your life, and you will feel the same pull, the same slow hope, and perhaps the same eventual silence. Not because you are broken, but because there is a mechanism underneath all of it, a way that solitude either deepens into strength or collapses into something that only resembles it from the outside. The difference is not willpower. It is not discipline or resilience in the self-help sense of those words. It is something more precise and more interior, and if you want to understand what that mechanism actually is, there is a video that maps it directly. You will find it in the pinned first comment below, or in the code appearing on screen now. It is worth the time. But stay here for a moment longer, because there is something that needs to be said about the people who left. Imagine a river that runs through two different landscapes. In the upper valley, it moves quickly, shallow and bright, and the villages along its banks draw from it easily. Buckets lowered, water taken, life made simple by the accessibility of the current. Further down, the river slows and deepens. It is less obvious. The surface no longer sparkles in the same way. The villages that once found it useful begin to find it inconvenient, too wide to cross easily, too deep to read, no longer offering the simple transaction of bucket and surface. They build their bridges elsewhere. They call the deep stretch difficult. And the river, of course, does not change its nature to accommodate the complaint. It simply continues, moving toward a depth the upper villages will never see, carrying more than they ever thought to ask it to carry. The people who grew uncomfortable in your presence, who pulled back or left or simply stopped being able to cross the distance, they were not diagnosing you. They were describing their own reach. They were built for a different stretch of water, for a current they could take from easily, and what they encountered in you was something they did not have the tools for. That is not a verdict. That is a geography. Perhaps every departure that felt like rejection was, in another light, the space clearing itself. Not as punishment, not as proof of your unworthiness, but as the room rearranging itself around what you were in the process of becoming, releasing the shapes that no longer fit the formation, the way a sculptor's block releases everything that is not the figure. It is a strange kind of mercy, arrived at through what felt only like loss. Schopenhauer observed that most human company functions as a kind of insulation, not against cold, but against the self. People gather, in part, to avoid the confrontation that silence brings. And so the person who finds themselves genuinely alone, not by choice but by the gradual incompatibility of their interior with the available crowd, is not being punished. They are being stripped of insulation. What remains when the insulation is gone is not nothing. It is the actual shape of who you are, unmediated, unperformed, meeting itself at last without an audience to perform for. That meeting is not always comfortable. Sometimes it is the loneliest thing imaginable, to be left alone with a self you are not yet sure you recognize, whose dimensions feel larger than the life you have been living, whose needs you have been postponing for years in exchange for belonging. But it may be that this is precisely the encounter your formation required. Not the people who stayed, not the warmth of being understood. The encounter with your own depth, in the only conditions under which it could be seen clearly. And perhaps that is the most quietly radical thing Nietzsche ever suggested. Not that suffering is noble, not that strength is glamorous, but that the self capable of creating its own values, rather than simply inheriting them from the nearest available crowd, cannot do that work in public. It requires the particular silence that comes after everyone has left, not the performed solitude of retreat, not the chosen quiet of a Sunday morning, but the deep silence that arrives when you have finally stopped waiting for someone to return and started, reluctantly, to look at what remains. The self you were always meant to become could not have been built in the presence of applause. Sit with that for a moment, because it asks something of you. It asks you to consider that every period you have spent trying to get back to company, to noise, to the reassurance of being witnessed, every frantic reaching outward, may have been an interruption of something that needed uninterrupted time. Not forever, not as a philosophy of permanent withdrawal, but long enough for the real formation to happen, without being bent by the pressure of other people's comfort. Imagine a cartographer who was given an island no one had mapped before. She arrives with instruments and intention, but every time she begins to take measurements, a group of travelers passes through and asks her for directions. She gives them because that is what you do when someone asks. She resumes her work and another group arrives. Days pass. The island remains unmapped because the act of being useful to others and the act of charting unknown territory cannot happen simultaneously. The map requires her to be unreachable. It requires a solitude that feels, to the travelers, like absence, and feels, to her, like the only condition under which the real work is possible. And the travelers, entirely reasonably, move on. They needed directions. She could not always give them. Their leaving was not cruelty. It was simply the logic of incompatible purposes meeting at a crossroads and parting without ceremony. This is what Jung meant when he described the process of individuation, the slow, interior movement toward becoming a whole self rather than a functional fragment of one. It is not a dramatic transformation. It happens in the margins, in the silences between conversations, in the moments when the persona, that carefully assembled face you wear in the social world, is finally set down because there is no one left to wear it for. And in that setting down, something else becomes visible. Not the shadow in its frightening sense, but the shadow in its honest one. The parts of you that never made it into the performance, the capacities you quietly abandoned because they did not fit the version of you that others found acceptable. Those abandoned parts do not disappear. They wait. And solitude, real solitude, the kind that arrives without your permission, is often the only condition in which they surface. Not to punish you, to return to you. How many times did you shrink something true about yourself to make it fit a conversation? How many times did you feel the distance between what you were saying and what you actually meant, and say it anyway, because the gap was easier to live with than the silence of being misunderstood? How many times did you choose the version of yourself that was easiest to love over the one that was most fully you? Those are not small questions. They are the questions that the loneliest people carry, because they are the ones who feel that gap most acutely. The distance between the self that performs and the self that waits, patient and unannounced, in the quiet that everyone else seems so eager to fill. There is a face passing through your mind right now, isn't there? Someone who left, or drifted, or simply could not stay at the depth you were reaching. And it may be that the same pattern will present itself again, with a different face, until the mechanism underneath it is understood. That mechanism, why certain connections cannot survive your growth, and what to do when you recognize it happening, is the subject of the video in the pinned first comment. It does not replace what we are doing here, but it names the machinery. It might be the piece that makes this reflection land somewhere useful. The self you were always meant to become could not have been built in the presence of applause. Sit with that for a moment, because it is not a consolation for loneliness. It is a description of how formation actually works. Applause asks you to repeat yourself. Applause rewards the performance, not the growth. And the growth, the real kind, the kind that changes not just what you do, but what you are capable of bearing. That kind has always happened in the room, with no audience. Nietzsche understood this, not as philosophy in the abstract, but as something he lived in his body. He spent years in near-total isolation, boarding houses in the Swiss Alps, long solitary walks, a silence that was not chosen so much as arrived at, because the world of his contemporaries had stopped being a place where he could think. What emerged from those years was not comfort, it was clarity. The kind of clarity that is only possible when you stop modulating your thoughts for the room you are in. Perhaps the reason his writing feels so immediate, even now, more than a century later, is precisely because it was never addressed to a crowd. It was addressed to whoever was alone enough to hear it. Imagine a river that runs underground for part of its course, swallowed by rock, invisible to the surface, flowing in absolute darkness for miles before it re-emerges in a valley no one expected. The people in that valley did not watch it form. They arrived at the bank after the river had already done the invisible work of carving its own channel through stone. They see only the clarity of the water, the steadiness of its flow, the way it does not rush or meander, because it has already found its direction. They call it a gift. They do not know about the darkness. They have no language for what the river passed through to arrive here. You may be that river. The years that felt like disappearance, the friendships that went quiet, the version of yourself that seemed to recede, the long months when nothing visible was happening. Those were not the absence of your life. They were the underground passage, the formation that no one witnessed because it was not yet ready to be witnessed. And the steadiness that people now sense in you, the quality they sometimes call calm or depth, without quite knowing why they reach for those words, may be nothing more and nothing less than the trace of stone that was carved in the dark. Jung would say something careful here. He would say that the self which emerges from genuine solitude is not the ego, not the I that plans and performs and manages the impression it makes. It is something he called the self, with a capital letter, the fuller, less defended center of the whole psyche, which includes everything the ego has tried to disown. The shadow, the unlived life, the grief that was never permitted to speak in a crowded room. Individuation, the name he gave to this process of becoming more wholly oneself, is not a social project. It cannot be, because the social world, by its nature, applies pressure toward coherence, toward the version of you that others find legible and comfortable. Solitude is where that pressure lifts, and what remains when the pressure lifts is closer to what you actually are. That is not a romantic idea. It is, if anything, a demanding one. because what remains when the pressure lifts is not always beautiful. Sometimes it is grief you postponed. Sometimes it is anger you learned to call by other names. Sometimes it is a want so old and unspoken that you had almost forgotten it belonged to you. Solitude does not flatter, it simply shows. But here is what the showing makes possible. When you meet those parts of yourself without an audience, without the need to translate them into something acceptable, you stop being managed by them from the inside. The shadow does not disappear in solitude, but it becomes, slowly, a known quantity, something you can sit with, rather than something that moves your decisions from below the surface, disguised as instinct or mood, or the vague sense that something is wrong without knowing what. How many times did you interrupt your own rest to solve a problem that was never yours? How many times did you feel the silence of a room and immediately fill it? Not because you had something to say, but because the silence itself made you uncertain about what you would find there. How many times did you return from a gathering and feel the strange weight of having been present everywhere except inside yourself? Those are not rhetorical failures. They are the signs of a psyche that has not yet made peace with its own interior. And the making of that peace, that is the work that solitude makes possible, and that no amount of company can do on your behalf. There is a face passing through your mind right now, isn't there? Someone who left, or someone who stayed but never quite arrived, or someone you performed yourself for so carefully that you eventually lost track of where the performance ended. And the quiet truth is that this face will be replaced, in time, by another face, and the same pattern will move beneath it, unless the mechanism underneath is understood. I've left a video in the pinned first comment that goes directly into that mechanism, why certain people recur in your life wearing different names, and what it tells you about the unfinished interior work. It is the natural companion to what we've been building here. The self you were always meant to become could not have been built in the presence of applause. Imagine a creature that lives at great depth, where the pressure would crush anything built for the surface. It does not experience that pressure as punishment. It was formed by it, shaped to it, sustained by it. Bring it to the surface, to warmth, to light, to the easy company of shallower waters, and it does not flourish, it dissolves. What most creatures call a perfect environment is, for this one, a kind of slow erasure. Perhaps this is what you have sometimes felt at gatherings where everyone else seemed comfortable, and you could not find the reason for your own discomfort, your own quiet sense of being in the wrong medium. Not broken, not defective, simply built for a different depth. And the people who could not stay with you at that depth, they were not cruel for leaving. They were simply built for different pressures, running their own invisible wars. Their departure was not a verdict on your worth. It may have been, in another light, the space clearing itself, the conditions arranging themselves, without your consent and without your understanding at the time, so that the real formation could begin without the constant negotiation of being witnessed. Not every absence is a loss. Sometimes it is the only way back to the parts of yourself you abandoned. So I want to leave you with one question to carry away from this, not to answer now, and perhaps not soon, but to sit with, in one of those solitudes that used to frighten you, and may, by now, feel slightly more like home. What would you have become if you had never been left alone with yourself? And is it possible that what you are now could only have emerged from exactly that silence? I'll tell you something briefly and honestly. There was a period in my own life that I understood, while I was inside it, as failure, a contraction. The circle of people around me grew very small, and then smaller, and I spent a long time interpreting that as evidence of something wrong with me. It was only later, not immediately, not heroically, that I began to see it differently, that the smallness had been a kind of mercy, that the silence I had been handed without asking for it, had given me back a version of myself I would not otherwise have had the quiet to find. I don't tell you this to make my story yours. I tell you because you stayed to the end of this reflection, and that means something about the kind of attention you bring to your own interior life, and I wanted to acknowledge that directly. Thank you for being here. If what we've moved through today felt like the beginning of something, the video in the pinned first comment is the next step. It names the mechanism underneath the pattern, and once you see it, it does not vanish, but it does lose some of its power over you. If this reflection reached something in you, consider leaving a like. It helps this kind of quiet work find the people who need it. And in the comments, I'd like you to write just this: I was not broken. I was being forged. Let it sit there. Let it be said. Sometimes the most important thing is simply to say the true thing out loud, even once, even to no one in particular. And if you'd like to stay, if you find that this kind of reflection is the company you were looking for, subscribing costs you nothing, and I promise the channel will never be loud about it. It will simply be here, the way a good room is here, quiet and waiting, and not going anywhere.